It does feel like we're living through a time of disruption with artificial intelligence, changing consumer values, social commerce. If you had to pick a single force that you think will really reshape the practice of marketing, what would it be?
If I had to pick one, I would say it would be AI-driven personalization. It's changing how we understand consumers, how we target them,
Yeah.
and even how we serve them and how decisions. But what's important is that it doesn't just make marketing more efficient. It fundamentally changes the relationship between companies and consumers. And definitely during this shift of relationship and a dynamics between business and consumers, it raises new question about trust, privacy, and autonomy.
Welcome to the HKUST MBA Superconnector podcast. In this episode, I speak with Professor Jie-Wen Hong. Professor Hong is the head of our Department of Marketing and teaches marketing strategy in our MBA program. We had a fascinating conversation about how she got started in her marketing journey, the key insights from her research, and her views on the future of marketing. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Professor Han, great to have you on our podcast and excited to have this chance to learn more about you and your research and teaching. I'd like to start at the beginning. You grew up and studied in Beijing. Then you made the move to the United States for graduate school. What was that transition like? What drew you to studying marketing, consumer behavior?
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting story. When I was in my senior year of college, I had this internship, and I had the opportunity to work with the founder of a company called Aurigus. It's a chain pizza store in China. So I worked with the founder who just graduated from Carnegie Mellon University, computer science, but he went back to Beijing for his girlfriend at the time. And so he started this kind of startup. I worked with him directly on marketing research for pizza, which was very new back in 1999. And that was a very eye-opening. Um, so to understand, to explain to consumers what pizza is really like, and then kind of understand what their preference was and how should add a adjustment to the original formula to cater to Chinese consumers' taste. So that was like very fun experience, and I also saw firsthand how understanding consumers can directly shape what we do at the business level. So that was what initially drew me to marketing and consumer behavior. So I moved to the US for grad school. And the transition was both exciting, but also challenging. It was a new environment, a new academic culture, but it also gave me a chance to explore these questions more deeply and see that everyday consumer decisions can be studied in very systematic and insight.
And then so I know you did your PhD at Kellogg, but before pursuing your PhD, you worked in marketing in Virginia. What was that experience like? And then what triggered you to go on for further study?
Yeah, I actually got a full-time job at a technology consulting firm, Vienna, Virginia, Texas corner. So working marketing there was a great reality check for me to connect what I learned in grad school to practice. And I was actually marketing specialist for this company and responsible for planning marketing strategy, the implementation. It was very fast paced and very execution oriented. But after a while, I found myself constantly asking why and why did a campaign work, why did consumers react this way, and often there wasn't time to really investigate these questions properly because we always have the next deadline. And so I think that was a turning point, and I realized that was really more interesting understanding underlying mechanisms than just optimizing outcomes. So that curiosity really kept pulling me back to on the my free time reading some of the academic research theory. So felt like going back for PhD was the change of direction is something I really wanted. And so it was
Yeah, so they give you that chance to actually explore the why.
yes.
And now Kellogg is a great school for marketing. um, did the fact that there's deep dish pizza in Chicago have anything to do with that too? Or
And I actually wasn't such a fan of deep dish pizza. I prefer the thin crust, but definitely Kellogg was itself was what drew me there for my PhD. And my experience at Kellogg was incredibly formative. It was a place where both rigor and creativity are taken very seriously. And what shaped me most was really the academic culture. You're constantly challenged but also supported to ask more insightful questions and not just to ask better questions, not just finding answers. So I think asking the question is something really unique that they push for. I was trained to think carefully about theory, but also to make sure understand it works and why it works. Also as an educator, I think how it influenced me to see teaching not just delivering knowledge, but also helping students develop a way of it.
And then you came to HKUST in 2000. And there's so many ties between Kellogg and HKUST now, our EMBA program, as well as our exchange programs. So you've been here nearly 18 years. What made HKUST the right place for you, and what's kept you here?
So I still remember time I came here for campus visit. We called the final interview on campus, the campus visit. So I actually had offers from US and also other Hong Kong universities. And before I came to USD, I thought I would stay in US. And since I've never been to Hong Kong, but this place drew me instantly with this energy and intellectual vitality and the people. Was scheduled to be 1 day visit. For now, I just asked whether I can stay for. Yeah, I actually attended party as well in one of the staff quarters. So I think so that was what initially. And of course, if you decide to came to Asia at time, there's no better place than HKUST. So what has kept me here since is again the same spirit. HKUST is a place that value both research and teaching, and it's also deeply connected to Asia, which is in fact more dynamic context to study gate servers. Over time, colleagues, students, that makes me.
Yeah, and I want to talk a bit more about that regional dimension as well. But coming to your research, you do a lot of research around how consumers think and feel. If you had to explain in one or two sentences, has there been a central puzzle that you've been trying to help solve with your research agenda? What's tying it all together?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for me to reflect on kind of my research journey. And I would say this is not necessarily all planned out. Reflective things or maybe intrinsic interest actually drives all these questions. And that's really about when do people well actually there are people usually know from prior research that people tend to make decisions rely on two different systems. Like system one, which is more rational, thinking based, analytical. The other is system two, which is more intuitive, rely on feelings. A lot of my research really is based on the agenda to answer the question, when do people rely on reasons versus feelings in making their decisions? And a lot of my research tried to unpack this tension because we like to think we're rational.
Yep.
But in reality, our decisions often are shaped by how we feel and other subtle psychological cues. So understanding how consumers rely on these two systems is both theoretically interesting and practically important.
Absolutely, yeah, and this is the common kind of debate, right, for executives. How are they making decisions? Logic versus right, one and system two. And that's one of your landmark papers. I follow my heart and we rely on reasons, which is interesting that people with an independent self-concept rely more on their feelings when making decisions, while those with an interdependent self-concept rely more on reasoning. Can you just expand on that? Help us understand that, and what does it mean for marketers and business leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. The key idea is that how we see ourselves shape how we make decisions. People with a more independent self-concept, which is we see ourselves as unique individuals, and also this is how we define ourselves as unique individuals. Compared to the other kind, which is those with a more interdependent self-concept, we tend to be East Asians. We tend to define ourselves by our relationships. So these two are found that those with the independent self-concept tend to rely more on their feelings because that's uniquely to self, very diagnostic of who you are. But when for those who with the interdependent self-concept, you need to justify a lot. And usually when you justify, you can't say this is how I feel. You have to come up with more logical reasons to justify your decisions. So for business leaders, I guess the implication is decision styles are not universal. If you're marketing in different cultural contexts or even to different segments, you need to match your messaging to how your consumers can decide.
Yeah, it's not at all, it's a very provocative finding, right? In the sense of I could see people who have a strong independence, right? Well, why shouldn't they be the ones who could reason through things logically and make their own decisions?
They do. But I think this finding is not to say that people with the independent don't think rationally, or it's about they would trust their feelings
Yes.
more so than it's not within a person, whether you're more feeling
Yeah.
based or reason based, but relatively, which type of people will rely more on it.
Yeah. And then also thinking about organizations, companies, leadership teams, the more we can get people to think about the we, then the more we'll make sure we're talking through decisions and trying to reason them through. It's fascinating. You also co-authored some research on how consumers experience wait times, which is a part of all of our lives. And I was interested to find that how long we feel we waited doesn't always match actual time. What's driving that difference, that gap, and what can service businesses, banks, restaurants, theme parks take away from?
Yeah, because I think reading is a very interesting topic. And the way we think about it, I mean, past research have found that we tend to make this judgment on how long we have waited based on two routes. It's again related to decision feeling versus rational. One thing we make, when you recall how long you waited, you can base on feelings. You felt bored or you felt pretty happy. Of course, if you were bored, you felt the wait is longer. But if I asked you, how many things did you do during the time? And for example, you're playing computer games while waiting for cell phone games. If I asked you, how long did you wait? Oh, you were playing games. It felt pretty fast. It's probably just a couple of minutes. But if I asked you, how many stages did you pass in that? Oh, I passed like 13 stages. Well, it must have felt a long time. See, depending on you anchor your judgment on how long you waited on your feeling or how much stuff you actually did during that time, you can arrive at very different judgments. So those kind of the anchor foundation theoretical basis that drive our research. So what we found is reading is not just about time, it's about the time is experience. So if you are uncertain, feeling lack of control, so it just make the wait feel very long. On the other hand, if you feel informed or engaged, then a longer wait can control. So this is kind of, I think for business, the takeaway is that managing perception is as important as managing actual time,
Yeah.
right? So simple things like giving updates, explaining delays, or making the wait more enjoyable and dramatically improve customer experience without changing the actual
Right.
time.
Yeah, that's interesting. So instead of trying to shorten the wait times all the time, there might be other ways to help the consumer. Okay. Let's talk about another research topic that I find personally fascinating: counterfeit consumption. You've looked at what consumers actually feel when they use a counterfeit product. Now, what did you find, and what does that mean for brands that are trying to design anti-counterfeit strategy?
Yeah, that's a topic my co-authors and I are intrigued about counterfeit consumption. But what's interesting is that consumers don't just evaluate counterfeits functionally, but there's also psychological experience attached. Some people will feel smart or savvy using them, but others feel a subtle sense of inauthenticity despite the fact they're using it. They have this imposter feeling that, this is inauthentic. So they feel kind of discount when using it. So especially in social settings where people can see that they're using, but not necessarily realizing they're using it, but they know they are using it. Despite the fact they're trying to signal that I'm using this brand name, this imposter feeling or inauthenticity can have important implications, like repercussions that they might think twice next time. So for brands, this means anti-counterfeit strategies doesn't necessarily only rely on law enforcement, but also they can also focus on reinforcing this psychological experience of authenticity. So making the genuine more meaningful or identity relevant. So if you shift people feel about the product, that this may effectively more effective to change their behavior rather than just restricting access to it.
And does this apply across different types of products, or are there any? Is it? I would imagine it's like luxury
Yes,
products, but yeah,
actually, I'm just going to speak from our empirical
yeah,
evidence. So we do look at private versus privately consumed goods and publicly consumed
okay,
goods. So if you're using a charging cable, I mean, I don't think it uses charging
right.
because
There's something like that.
charging cable would have quality concerns.
Okay,
So we're actually looking at, I recall at the top of my head, categories that don't involve quality concerns, but it's privately consumed, that doesn't have any social safety.
so I use that in my home kind of.
Yes. So for
Yeah,
that, people's sense of inauthenticity will actually be lessened. They actually don't express. But it's actually interestingly the ambivalence that it's for those public consumer
yep.
goods, which people often used to send social signals. But it's also in these situations that they feel greater discomfort and inauthenticity.
Fascinating. And you're doing research and teaching here in Hong Kong. This is a place where we get to see a lot of what's happening in the world of marketing. You know, we see all the super apps in China, the social commerce, live streaming. When you teach, for example, our exchange students who come to Hong Kong and then they go back to Europe or the US or South America, do you think the marketing strategies and approaches being developed here in Asia, do you think they're also applicable to the rest of the world, or are there some big differences to be aware of?
Yeah, I do think Asia, especially China, is pushing the frontiers in many ways in terms of integration, speed, and innovation. So things like these super apps you mentioned or live stream commerce are much more developed here. But that said, not everything will transfer directly. I think some of these systems are shaped by specific infrastructure or cultural context. So, for example, as I mentioned, Asian consumers are more interdependent, so which
Yeah.
means they are much more easily influenced by social trends and peers. So that may actually have cultural variations. But what will export, though, is underlying mindset, essentially meaning business should be more consumer centric, data driven,
Mm.
and more willing to innovate and adapt. So I think it's less about copying the exact model, but more about learning the principles.
And then these principles, so you've been in marketing for a long time, doing research, understanding the leading edge of marketing. It does feel like we're living through a time of disruption with artificial intelligence, changing consumer values, social commerce. If you had to pick a single force that you think will really reshape the practice of marketing, what would it
If I had to pick one, I would say it would be AI driven personalization. It's changing how we understand consumers, how we target them,
be?
and even how we serve them and how decisions. But what's important is that it doesn't just make marketing more efficient, it fundamentally changes the relationship between companies and consumers. And definitely during this shift of relationship and a dynamics between business and consumers, it raises a new question about trust, privacy,
Mm.
and autonomy.
Tell me more about the questions on autonomy.
I would think that, for example, you find consumers increasingly are a lot of time place a passive role. Fine, for example, you are pushed on like Red Note.
Yeah.
You are pushed on these live streams of certain product, and before it was actively searching process on Taobao, and we see that actually this e-commerce is changing from more of this active searching
Mm.
to being pushed.
Yeah.
So, of course, on one hand, now I think consumers are enjoying the convenience of being pushed. I don't have to actually think about what I want. I'll see, oh, this one push looks good. I'm just going to add it and try it. But increasingly, I think, and then probably after a while, they would appreciate the autonomy of making decisions.
Yeah. So this trade-off between it's easy to get it pushed to us, but then
Yes.
maybe we do need to put some effort into making our own decisions.
Yes, absolutely.
So what do you think marketing will look like, let's say 5 years from now?
I think in 5 years, I think it's first of all, things are changing so rapidly. It's very hard to predict what's gonna happen. But if I have to,
I saw a crystal ball in your office.
that's my wishful
Yeah.
thinking, not my ability. So in 5 years, if I had to, predict, which is most likely unreliable, I think marketing will become much more adaptive and real time. And instead of designing campaigns in advance, it will be continuous adjusted based on like data, and you have to react super fast. I don't know if you saw that the ad where McDonald's is fighting
Right.
hamburger, and then
Yep.
right away like all the so you just have to think about, and that's unthinkable that your CEOs will be able to produce a social media just in a matter of days and that's necessary. So I think in the future we'll just see this kind of uh, real time, like super fast, adaptive
Yeah.
things. And we are also another thing is I think uh, we will move closer to true one-to-one personalization,
Yep.
essentially achieving a second of one.
So, and it feels like both the speed of marketing and the personalization, a lot of that's going to have to be driven by AI
Yeah.
algorithms, maybe designing agents. But what role then, if any, do you think there is for human intuition or the role of a marketing manager in that type of?
Yeah, I think everyone is thinking about not just in marketing, the dynamics between humans and then AI. Think it's, if you think about it, uh, differentiation in the future will come less from access to data. Of course,
Yeah.
there is, but it also, to some extent, leveled the playing field a little bit when it comes to that. More from how creative companies can be. So strategy and judgment, I would say, become actually more important and less. So, algorithms, they don't fully understand meaning, and I think human insight has always been essential and will still be essential for marketers to ask the right questions, interpret the data, and of course, make ethical decisions.
Yes.
I hope this episode gets you thinking about the ways that advances in technology interact with what humans can uniquely do. Marketing is certainly an area where we are seeing both rapid advances in AI and equally a role and responsibility for people that will be more important than ever. As we say at HKUST, machines can learn, only people can lead. If you're interested in learning more about Professor Han's research, please check out the links in the show notes below. And if you haven't already, do subscribe to this podcast to make sure you are the first to hear of the next